now. Now I am going to introduce our first speaker. Our first speaker is Wade Harkins. He's an Angular consultant. Wade has been fascinated by computers since he first got his hands on one and started teaching himself to code in 4th grade. Starting with BASIC, he discovered HTML and VBScript, which existed at the time, and later JavaScript, XML, and CSS by taking apart web pages. From there, Wade began experimenting with every programming and markup language he could find a compiler or interpreter for, particularly those well-suited for automation and multimedia. Wade is now a software engineer who has over 8 years of professional web development experience. In his career, there aren't many tech stacks Wade hasn't touched, but he currently is showcasing his expertise in Angular, helping clients migrate from AngularJS to Angular and embrace micro front-end architecture and creating uniform applications by architecting robust design systems and web component libraries. Wade enjoys video games, drawing, 3D modeling, and writing terrible music. So take it away, Wade.
All righty. And I am not the one who wrote that. That was something that I got from one of the technical writers at Meetup. So every time I hear that, it just makes me laugh. It's true, but it's just so flowery. I gave them, I think, 3 sentences and they turned it into that.
Also, Wade's modest. His music's pretty good.
All right. Am I sharing? Okay. Yes.
Yes, sure.
So I'm going to talk about accessibility with Angular. So how to make your Angular apps more accessible friendly. I wasn't sure whether I was going to get an intro or not. I forgot whether I set one. So I'm clicking on the wrong place. I've got a nice little intro slide here. As Julie said, I am an Angular consultant at Pitovi. I'm passionate about documentation, design systems, and accessibility, and I am a terrible artist and musician. I enjoy doing both things, but not good at either. If you want to look at my stuff on GitHub, there's some things on there. I'm VDT dev. In retrospect, I know those letters sound a lot alike, so it's not the easiest thing to read aloud. And then I'm videographist on Twitter. So let's start out by talking about what I mean by accessible. So the WCAG, I used to say WCAG, but I've heard people now spelling it out. So I don't know if that's how it's supposed to be or not, is an organization or a working group that's part of the W3C. They really like acronyms. So they have an acronym that's POUR, which is perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. And they use this as kind of their overview of what accessibility encompasses. So perceivable, are users able to perceive the content, whether through looking at a screen, hearing it spoken aloud, or feeling it through like a Braille screen reader. Operable, are users able to navigate and interact with their content, whether they're using a touch screen, a mouse, voice command, keyboard. Understandable, so assuming they can perceive and operate it, does it make sense? This doesn't have to require any sort of special need. It has to do with consistency and whether your UI makes sense, do buttons do button-like things, etc. And then robust. Are a variety of people able to access your application and make use of it using things like web browsers or screen readers or Braille readers, etc. So in general, web accessibility includes things like making use of meaningful semantic HTML. So this is using appropriate tags for situations that they're intended for, providing alternate text and descriptions for images and other non-textual content, and enabling navigation with keyboard or assistive devices such as speech. And the meaningful semantic HTML, by that I mean using things more than just making everything a div, using buttons or even things like paragraph tags, lists, that sort of thing, rather than relying purely on styles to add context to the HTML, because assistive devices really rely on the tags that people can't see to relay the meaning of what the content is to people that are not able to see it or need to be able to perceive it in some other manner. So the alternate to that, when you're doing something maybe that's really groundbreaking or just unusual and there's not a tag for it, this is when you fall back to using ARIA roles and attributes, which is another acronym courtesy of the W3C, stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And these are things that you can add to HTML elements to provide that additional semantic meaning that's not present through existing elements. There's also consideration of using accessible color contrast and respecting user motion preferences. So on the topic of semantic HTML, we've got two markups here that end up with the same visual appearance. However, one of them is using semantic HTML and one of them is not. And as you may be able to guess, the one that is using nothing but div tags with an image and a span tag thrown in is the one that's not using semantics. So that is not what you want to go for. On the right, we are using our navigation is inside of a nav header or a nav tag. We've got our page header inside of a header tag. And typically, the nav should be inside the header, but not always. Our main content area is denoted using the main element, and we've got a section inside of it that contains a paragraph, and then the page footer is in a footer tag. Again, this visually wouldn't look any different to somebody just using a regular web browser, but without using the specific contexts or specific tags, the assistive devices don't have any context as to what the different elements of the page are supposed to represent. So we like the semantic HTML approach. This also meets one of the WCAG guidelines for adaptability. It's guideline 1.3, and that it gives context to content otherwise only conveyed visually. So when we come talking about accessibility in Angular, the approach is a combination of using standard accessibility conventions and leveraging some tools and services that are provided by Angular and other libraries. So starting out, most things that you see visually in Angular are components in one way or another. So we're going to focus on those. So building an accessible Angular component, and this may sound a bit repetitive, but is a combination of using appropriate semantic HTMLs or avoiding divestation. I thought that was a clever pun when I wrote it at the time. When possible, augmenting native elements, and this is particularly true for form inputs. We'll talk about this more in a second if that doesn't make or have any meaning to you at the moment. And then utilizing content projection when a native element needs to be wrapped. This is for things like a input field, a text input field is a element that can't have any nested elements inside of it. So wrapping that is the best way to approach creating a component that has that behavior. And then when all else fails, making use of ARIA roles and attributes when native elements don't suffice. And then also supporting focus and keyboard navigation, making sure that your component doesn't take those things away from what elements would have by virtue of just using semantic elements. So augmenting native elements, as I said, when possible, you want to make components that augment semantic elements, in this case, using an attribute selector. So if you look at the first component here at the top of the code sample, typically with an Angular component, the selector may be something like just the string app icon button, and that's what you would use in your template. However, by using this selector notation where we have button and then in square brackets, we have the of the default component name in the form of an attribute selector, you can, in your markup, use button with app icon button as an attribute, and that will turn that button into your component while retaining the built-in functionality that buttons have. A button may not seem like a big deal. It's just a little rectangle, maybe with some round corners that people have to click on. When you hover over it, it changes color. But buttons do a lot of things. They have meaning just in the fact that screen readers know their buttons, but they also support tabbing to them. They can be disabled. There's a lot of functionality in that. And rather than reinventing the wheel, it makes a lot more sense just to use a selector and it basically extend the underlying element. ARIA is an acronym that stands for Accessible Rich Internet Application. It's basically just a term that's used to describe widgets, I believe is what they call them, within websites that don't have a native semantic element equivalent. So the other advantage you get here, so for something like the second example where I've got a component that is a list element, basically, it's extending an ordered list. There's not really interactivity associated with a list item. However, it still holds semantic meaning, and a screen reader will read a list, the items in a list differently than it would just text. So using element or native element augmentation makes sense here as well. So onto the idea of the ARIA roles and attributes. Sometimes you're building a component that represents something that doesn't have a native element that represents it. For example, tabs, a component where you've got some sort of display and then a selection of buttons, and clicking those buttons changes what gets displayed in that content area. The way you'd represent this just in vanilla HTML is by using the role attribute and with a value of tab item. Now, if you've got a component, and in this component example, I don't have a selector in there, but just pretend the selector for it would be my dash component. Typically, you could leave it up to the person using your component, maybe yourself, maybe somebody else, to remember to add that role to it each time. However, the component decorator in Angular allows you to pass in a host attribute that can have, it's basically an object, and each value in that can map to an attribute. So in this example here, we're setting the role attribute within host to tab item, and that means whenever this component gets used, the markup will have that role attribute attached to it without having to manually place it on there. It's worth noting that this was the kind of the shortest and most direct way to do this example, but there's also a decorator you can use within your component on a property that's called host binding that allows you to set a property getter that can also return a value that gets added to the component element at runtime as well. So moving on to a more complex example here, and this is different than a role. In this case, we've got a progress bar, and this is not a great example because there actually is a progress bar element. I believe it's just called progress, but just pretend that doesn't exist. So there are, in addition to the role attribute, there are also ARIA attributes, which are attributes that begin with ARIA and then have a dash in them. And these are properties that provide additional semantic meanings to elements that are represented with an ARIA role. So in this case, the progress bar, visually telling a assistive device that an element is a progress bar is great. However, progress bars have a lot of information in that's visually represented, such as what the current value is, and how far that fills up the progress bar, what the maximum value is. So in this case, using that same host attribute within the component select or component decorator, putting in the ARIA value min is an attribute that specifies what the minimum value is for progress bar, which in this case is 0. And then for ARIA value now, which is the ARIA attribute that indicates what the current value of the progress bar is, we're using the this notation where we've got the square brackets. This is the same as you'd use for a property binding within an Angular template. However, in this case, just because of a convention you have to follow with Angular, for property names that have hyphens in them, you have to prefix them with ATTR period to make sure that it actually gets mapped. So in this case, this ARIA value now attribute would be bound to a property within our component called value. So whenever that changes, the value that's related to assistive devices would automatically update, and it would be reflected with what the current value is. So this adding the ATTR period applies to all of the ARIA attributes, including things like ARIA label. And again, you could use the host binding decorator to accomplish these 3 bindings as well. So it's also important that if you're building something that needs to be interactive, that people are able to access it with a keyboard and they don't just skip past it. So at minimum, users should be able to navigate using the tab key. It means jumping to interactive points on the page by pressing the tab key. This is one of the guidelines from the WCAG under the operable part of core. Native elements already provide this. This is another great reason to use augmentation. Buttons are tab targets, anchors are, and input fields are as well. But if you need to, you can make use of the tab index attribute to add or remove an element from the tab flow. So in this case, the first example, setting the tab index to 0 makes it so that it can gain focus through tabbing based on where it is in your document. And tab index -1 means that an element that might otherwise be reachable through tabbing will not be. That could be useful for maybe a disabled state or some other reason why an element would already be focusable, but you would like it not to be. It's important to note that you can technically set it to values that are greater than 0. However, doing so interrupts the natural tabbing order of the page. By default, if you've got 4 buttons, if a user's in a left to right language mode, those buttons will gain focus in the order that they appear in your document. And by inserting an element that's got maybe a 1 as its tab index, as the user's tabbing, it will jump to that and then return to the normal tab flow, which is discouraged. So let's move on to services, libraries, and tools. First thing I'm going to talk about here is the title service, which is something that Angular provides. It's inside of the Angular/platform browser package. And this is important because typically with a screen reader, the first thing that's read to a user is the page title. So if you've got in your application, if you're just setting your application page title in your index.html and never changing it, then that's not really communicating to users the current state of the page. It also kind of makes it a nightmare to figure out if you have multiple bookmarks on an application and they all have the exact same title, very difficult to go back and figure out what you're going to. So this title service basically allows you to dynamically change the title of a page. You import it, and then you can call set title on the title service, and it will change the title of your page. Now, this has gotten a little bit easier in Angular 14, as we now have the ability to specify titles directly in your routes. So here, rather than having to use the title service just in our routes, we've got our home component and our deals component. This was previously tied into kind of a joke demo application that was a Alley Cat used car web page. So just please bear with the cat references. So the home component would set the title page to cat cars -home page, and in deals, you'll have perfect deals. So your bookmarks will be different, and the user will know what page they're on after they click a link. So you can be even more fancy with this. Again, as part of Angular 14, there is a service called Title Strategy, or actually, I guess it's a class that you can extend and provide in your application's module. And this allows you to override a method called update title that is called each time the route state changes. And you can utilize the state of your current route snapshot to dynamically construct a title. This is useful as kind of a middle ground between the ease of having your titles directly in your routes, which is easy, but requires you to repeat information if you're going with the convention of your application name dash the current page, but is more powerful than the title, I'm sorry, not the title strategy, the title service, in which case you have to build the title each time. So like in this example, if there's a title from our build, this would have a method within this class called build title that would derive the title from some route information. And if you've got a title based on your state, then it will insert it into your page. Otherwise, it defaults to a placeholder, or I guess a fallback title. It may also be useful in certain cases when you land on a route to give focus to a particular element. There's kind of pros and cons to this. It can be disorienting to users that are using screen readers to click on a link and then have focus go somewhere else. But there are also conventions you can use to allow people to skip repeat things like the main navigation. This is useful for like if a route change opens up a modal or something, you can directly give focus to the content of that modal so that a user doesn't have to tap through the entire page and then end up in that modal. And this is just something that you can pipe off of your router by injecting it into a component and subscribe to the navigation end filter. Or navigation end event, excuse me. There's also the material CDK, which is maintained by Google. It's separate from the Angular material library, and CDK is a component development kit. So this is a set of behavior primitives for building UI and includes a number of accessibility tools. A lot of these are used internally by material components, but they also form a great foundation for not having to reinvent the wheel when you're trying to keep your own components accessible. These include things like List Key Manager, which we're going to go over here in a second, Focus Monitor, which is a service that allows you to be notified when focus on elements change. And it also gives you the ability to know how focus changed. So you can be aware if somebody clicked on something with a mouse, used a touch screen, or if it was accessed through keyboard interaction. And another service called Live Announcer, which allows you to basically do something like you would with a toast message, where you've got like a notification bar that slides up on your page, and have it announce that toast message as it happens to a user auditorily. So as I mentioned, the List Key Manager, which this is a really cool service, or I guess it's not a service. It's an interface technically, I suppose. But it allows you to create lists that can function basically like a menu or a list box interface component you'd expect using those variables. And this helps satisfy the operable guideline for those elements. So basically, it provides keyboard interactivity so that if you've got a list and you tab to it, the list gains focus, and then the user can make use of the arrow keys, as well as things like the home key, end key, and page up and page down to navigate between choices within those lists, and then use like the space key or the enter key to select an item. This is a very common pattern, as you'd expect. However, in practice, creating this from scratch in a way that's accessible is actually quite tricky. There are two main implementations of this. We've got the Focus Key Manager, which is useful for cases where your list items are already elements that can natively receive browser focus, so things like buttons. And then we've got the Active Descendant Key Manager, which is for other types of elements where you need to use ARIA attributes to indicate to assisted devices which element, currently has focus. So I've got a little demo video here of a implementation using the Focus Key Manager. So when you first tab into this, the entire list gains focus, and then using the arrow keys, you can navigate through them. When you reach the last item, it wraps to the top of the list. This also has a nice feature where you can implement type ahead support, where basically, as the user starts typing, you can set a custom timeout. It will jump to whatever list item text content matches the string that the user typed. So this is stuff that you get in like a dropdown or a native dropdown element, but is a whole lot of work to implement from scratch without something like this to help. We've also got a number of other utilities. There is a high contrast mode detector service that detects high contrast mode for Windows users. I recently watched a video that has suggested that there's going to be an alternative to this that is supportive of more browser standard ways of detecting color preferences or contrast preferences that are cross browsers and will apply to things other than Windows, but I don't believe that's actually been completed yet. We've also got the ARIA describer service, which is able to allow you to create invisible elements containing message content for use with visual elements that you don't actually want text to be displayed on screen for sighted users, but you want that information to be there for screen readers and other assistive devices. Focus monitor, which I believe I mentioned before, the live announcer service. And then there is a nice SAS mixin called CDK Visually Hidden that you can import into your style sheets and apply to elements that you want to be accessible to assistive devices, but don't want general users to see on the screen. A good example of that would be for the navigation section of your page. It's a good convention to have, before reaching the navigation section, a link that basically you can say skip navigation, and it'll take a user using a screen reader or another assistive device directly to the main page content, so they don't have to listen to every navigation item you have each time they land on a new page. And this gives you an easy way to do that. And then lastly, making use of ESLint is really helpful for making sure that you follow best practices when it comes to template HTML accessibility. There's an Angular ESLint package that's available on GitHub. I think I have a link to it in my sources coming up. But if you search for Angular ESLint, you'll find it. And it's got a number of rules that are useful for making sure that you're following best practices. So you can include rules that will let you know if you've got a visual element that supports alternative text and you haven't provided any to it. We've also got one that makes sure that elements like headers and buttons that are tab targets or focus targets have content within them that's accessible. So you'll get a warning if you have a button that only contains an image, if that image doesn't have alternate text. Actually, that's a good question. I don't know if it's smart enough to know if an image contains alternate text would satisfy it or not. And then for forms, making sure that your labels aren't just willy-nilly and unassociated with things, and also that they're actually associated with form fields. A fairly helpful one that lets you know if you're trying to use an ARIA attribute that doesn't exist, and one that makes sure that if you have click or mouse event handlers on an element, that you also have a keyboard equivalent, because that's important for people using keyboard navigation. And let's see, is it on there? Yes, Angular ESLint is the fourth link on here. And that is my presentation.
Thank you so much, Wade. I actually have a question for you.
Yeah, sure.
For those of us who don't have disabilities, are there ways for us to get a better feel of what somebody with a disability will see when they go to our website? Does that make any sense? I mean, how?
Yes, if you're using Chrome, here, let me get out with this. There is, oh, here we go. If you go into the inspector in Chrome here, you can, and I believe I had to switch something to make this work, but if you see this little person up in the corner and you click on that, this changes to the accessibility tree. So you can see exactly what context is being provided here. So like all of these, let's see, like it identifies this as a link, and it has, you can see the text that will be read when that item is focused. So this is a great way to do it. Maybe slides isn't the best web page to use as an example for highlighting what these meanings are, but that's a really useful tool. And I believe that's something that becomes, there's this accessibility tree that you'll see over on the right by default, and you can click to enable full page accessibility tree, and that'll make this little button pop up over here. Another thing that's useful, if you're on Mac, you can turn on accessibility options and turn on the voiceover. Just be ready to hear a lot of text that's read very fast and feel very disoriented. I know I feel very disoriented when trying to navigate without sight. Those are both good options if you want to both see how your page is being interpreted and get a feel for what like a screen reader would give you, or what the effect the screen reader would give you is. I know there's also plugins that you can find that will simulate different color blindness options as well. And then aside from that, I think just reading through the quick reference on the WCAG website is interesting. It's a lot of information, but if you just kind of read the outline, it'll give you a good idea of the types of things to think about when you're building for accessibility. The real underlying theme here is, rather than with the exception of color contrast and that sort of thing for color blindness and people with low vision, rather than trying to make sure that your application works for certain disabilities, just if you focus on making sure that your website has as much semantic meaning and things have alternate descriptions, that's really the meat that assistive devices rely on to be able to convey that meaning. So if you're able to follow those best practices, you're in pretty good shape. There's also, if you want to see how well your application is doing in general, if you enable lighthouses, it's not going to let me do it. But you can include accessibility as an audit in the Lighthouse report generator, and it'll give you some general ideas of things that you've done wrong or don't meet best practices. That'll be things like accessibility. It'll also warn about some of the things, those ESLint rules I mentioned would catch as well. It's worth noting that automated accessibility checks are not the full picture because they can't entirely simulate like how people will interact with your application. So it's important to do manual testing and learn about those things. And I'm by no means an expert on all of that stuff.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. I know I used to do a lot more with accessibility, and I remember there used to be pages you could go to test the accessibility of your website, but I admittedly haven't been good lately. So I appreciate you expanding on that.
Yeah, no problem.
Do we have any questions for Wade? You can unmute yourself if you want to ask, or you can type it in the chat. I did think that was an awesome presentation on accessibility. It's been a while since we've done anything like that. So I do really appreciate having a talk on accessibility. I don't think enough. I don't think my company is doing enough.
Yeah, I know. I've kind of, my mom growing up was a speech pathologist and very interested in like language tools and things like that. So I feel like I've been brought up to think about it anyway, but I've been on one or two clients, and I guess one very big client where I realized we were being asked to make a card that was dismissible, but you could only see the dismiss X when you hovered over the card, and you couldn't tab focus on it. And I realized there's no way somebody that's using like just a keyboard or couldn't see would not have any idea what this meant. And like the design really, they said, yeah, it's not accessible, but you don't have time to worry about accessibility. I'm like, it's not good. So really kind of sent me on the rabbit hole, being like, there's got to be stuff you can do. Accessibility is intimidating, but it's one of those things where just being intimidated by it and doing nothing is a lot worse than trying, and doing even like some accessibility is better than none.
Right, I agree. And Mark says that, well, ESLint rules, I'm sure, help a lot. And
yeah,
you have to go take a look at our ESLint rules to see if we're actually testing for that. Caroline says, thanks for sharing. It was great. I didn't know about the accessibility tree. I didn't either.
Yeah, it's quite nice. I think it's still considered like a beta feature, but it is available through that little side area. If you expand on what's available in like the CSS inspector and choose accessibility, it should give you that checkbox to get the full feature thing.
Yeah, that was new to a bunch of us, so that was very useful. Do we have any more questions, and can we get a copy of your slides? That's my next.
Yes, I can make a copy of my slides and share it with you.
Perfect. Do we have any more questions for Wade? Yes, the session recording will be sent. I have to be honest, I don't quite know how it works. Maybe you do, Gemma-Dean, but after the recording, after I stop the recording, I think Women Who Code handles it all directly and provides it. Is that right, Gemma-Dean?
Yeah, that's my understanding is we submit it to Women Who Code Global and they end up putting it on the Women Who Code YouTube channel.
Yeah, so if you check our YouTube channel a couple of weeks, I don't know how long it takes, but if you do check out the Women Who Code YouTube channel, you should be able to find the recording there afterwards.
And I will
Okay.
work on making a copy of this and sharing the link in chat.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, I think we will go on to our next speaker. And now I'd like to introduce Mark. Mark Thompson is a developer consultant and Angular technical lead. Mark started his career studying Python and Django for 4 years. When he got his first job offering that required Angular, he discarded everything he learned and invested all of his time learning Angular. That was when V2 was just released, and since then, Mark has helped companies migrate their projects to the latest version of Angular, which is 14. During coffee breaks, Mark likes to share cow gifts and funny videos. During his free time, he enjoys buying Steam games, just like my son, and only finding time to play half of them. So welcome, Mark.
Awesome, thank you. Go ahead and share my screen.
Okay.
Very cool. And then hopefully if I click this button, you guys see
Perfect.
some slides.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you for the introduction. As mentioned before, my name is Mark Thompson. I'm going to actually move. Oh no, I don't see my mouse. So this is going to be difficult. Okay, hopefully the audience tab won't overlap any content I need to read. Yeah, my name is Mark Thompson. Yes, that is a photo of me. I know, don't quite look like that now. I have a stash, but that is indeed me. Not to be confused with the Mark Thompson who is on the Google Angular team. I am the Mark Thompson that's on the Bitovi Angular team. As mentioned, I like to help with migrations for Angular major versions, and I'm a fan of RxJS and GRX and X and Ionic. So today, I'm going to talk about the strictly typed reactive forms RFC. And yes, about time. About time because the first logged issue about the lack of strict types for reactive forms dates back to 2016, back in V2. And this issue has been open and closed over and over again over time. And eventually, this year in June, we got some good news. We have strict types added to the reactive forms. So to understand and appreciate all of that fun stuff, we're going to go ahead and talk about the reactive forms API, why it needs strict types, what are those types, and some common gotchas. But before we jump into all of that, what does RFC stand for? Yeah, does it stand for reactive form controls? Does it stand for really fierce code? React fried chicken? That's an inside joke because our React team works on a project that involves with a company that serves a lot of fried chicken. No, it is request for comments. A request for comments is typically an open forum where a proposal for a new standard is being introduced. Typically, these requests for comments include examples and explanations over several points of view on why such a dramatic change wants to be introduced to a library or a framework. Luckily for us, towards the end of 2021, there was an RFC opened by Dylan, where they wanted to add the strictly typed form or types to the reactive forms. So shout outs to Dylan, Alex, and Andrew, who currently work on Google's Angular team. Awesome stuff. So to appreciate that RFC and all the changes that they brought, let's go ahead and review a little bit about what the Reactive Forms API is and talk briefly about the template-driven forms. For anyone who wants a more in-depth analysis on forms in Angular, Angular has a large documentation on everything to do with forms. Go ahead and take a peek at that. To summarize it, there are two flavors when it comes to forms in Angular. There's template-driven forms, and then there's reactive forms. Template-driven forms advertised by Angular is that they are made for simple forms. They are fairly straightforward to add, whereas reactive forms are a bit more robust. They are a lot more testable. And if forms are a key part of your application, you're going to want to opt into reactive forms. That being said, to each their own. I've seen a lot of success with reactive forms. I've seen a lot of success with template-driven forms. Do not feel that you have to shift just because Angular said so. They are both great solutions. So to start us off, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about template-driven forms. On the upper left-hand corner, you'll see that I am declaring a component. And in that component, I have a property favorite color, which is initialized as blue. And in my template, which is in the lower left-hand corner, I am binding my favorite color to an input using the ng model directive. In the upper right-hand corner, you can see as I interact with my application, I am changing the text of my input. And below that in the purple background text, you can see my form control state being updated as I am changing the value of the input. What's going on here is that my component has a property which is being passed to the ng model. The ng model directive then creates a form control, which is what's responsible for maintaining that little piece of state for my form, and then using that form control to update my view. Likewise, when my view gets updated, it communicates to my form control, which notifies my ng model, and then updates that property on my component. That was a lot, I know. Let's look at a complicated diagram. So I have a component, I have a property, right? There's a favorite color. It sends that information to ng model. ng model creates my form control. That form control then will update my view. And you can imagine the other way around. If I update the view, it'll notify the form control, which then lets the ng model know, and the ng model will prompt my component, and then it updates the property. Yeah, you guys get it. Let's talk about reactive forms. So reactive forms takes a slightly different approach. Reactive forms, at a glance, seems a bit more scary, but it's a lot more simple. On my reactive forms and my component, I have a favorite color form control, which I'm initializing its value with blue. I am passing that form control to my template using the form control directive, and then that control updates my view. So let's look at the model for that. I have a component that creates a form control. When I update the form control, it updates my view. And when I update my view, it notifies my form control. Note, my form control technically doesn't even notify my component that this is happening because it has a good direct communication to the form control, and that form control is being updated. The component doesn't have to necessarily know that this is happening unless I want to be notified of it. A lot less complicated than template-driven forms. But hey, like I said, both solutions are great. So to understand a bit of the whole control ideas here, we need to understand the three fundamental building blocks of Angular forms. We have form controls, we have form groups, we have form arrays, and each of these classes extend what's called an abstract control. This abstract class, abstract control, is a collection of common properties and methods that my form control and form group and form array will share. That being said, form control, form group, and form array can differ. They can have extra properties or methods. For instance, form arrays, as you can tell from the name of it, have some array-like things such as length or a push method. Form controls specifically are for an individual piece of state, whereas a form group is a record-like collection of form controls, and a form array is an array of form controls. So let's go ahead and check out form groups and form arrays. I'll start with, I can't go to the next slide. Okay, there's the next slide. In the upper left-hand corner, you can see I have a component where I'm creating a form group. My form group has two form controls. Their names are favorite and least favorite. And in my template, I'm using the form group directive to bind that group to my form. And now, because my form group is binded to that form, I can now identify my controls by name. So my inputs, I'm using the form control name directive, and I'm passing favorite for my favorite control and my least favorite for my least favorite control. And you can see in the demo, I can update both inputs, and my form group state is being updated based off of my input changes. Pretty cool. Let's go for the more complicated of the three. Let's go about a form array. Now, form arrays are array-like form groups, as I like to think of it. You can see in my component on the left, I am initializing a form array where I have 2 form controls. And I'm stuffing that form array into a form group, which then in my template, I have a form, I'm passing that form group, and then I'm using a mixture of divs, inputs, and ng containers to get access to my form array. So I'm using the form array name directive to get access to that array or that form array, and then I'm iterating over the indexes to set the form control names of my inputs. Because form array is an array-like structure, each of the quote-unquote names of my controls are simply just the indexes that they are in that array. So I know that's a bit complicated. We'll jump back to that in a minute, but that is basically what a form array is. You can see here on the right, one thing that's really nice about form arrays is that they have order, and it's really easy to dynamically add and remove controls as needed. So depending on your use case, you might need to use a form array. Pretty cool. All right, so now that we've rushed over what the Reactive Forms API is, let's talk about why we need to add strict types, or why it was such a great thing that they did. First off, Reactive Forms API is tricky. It's tricky because the lack of types can make you make wrong assumptions about what is happening. So for instance, let's go ahead and look back at our form group example. In my demo, you can see I'm interacting with the view. I have a favorite and least favorite form control, and I'm updating their values. If you were to guess what the value of that form group was, you might think that it is an object with properties favorite and least favorite. Favorite and least favorite will probably be strings, because as I update my inputs, I'm getting different string values. That's a good guess. But if you dig further into the docs, you'll note that when I disable a input, that value will now become excluded from that form group. So as I disable my favorite input, its value is no longer included in that form group's value. If that wasn't confusing enough for you, if I disable all of my form controls, now all of the controls of my form group are disabled. Therefore, my form group is disabled. Therefore, its value is the value of all the disabled form controls. Okay, cool. Don't give up on me yet. It gets a little bit more complicated. If you reset a form control, which is where you call reset, that value becomes null. So with all of that in mind, when you look at the value, you might think it's an object where it's the names of each control, and it's the value type that they have. They can be optional, and they can potentially be null. So yeah, they are tricky. What else makes them tricky is also the idea that everything at the end of the day is just an abstract control. So what do I mean by this? Well, if you look at the types when I'm trying to access favorite color for my controls, which gives me an object where each key is the name of each control, you'll note that when I hover over it, I get a nasty type error about index signatures, but that's not important. Let's look at what the type is. The type is abstract control, right? So TypeScript at the time doesn't know that favorite color is a form control, right? We can tell because we can see when I initialize my form group that, yeah, it's clearly a form control, but TypeScript doesn't know this. Also, this whole index signature thing is a bit tricky. This is because the controls doesn't actually even know which names are actually in the form group. So technically, I can do things like try to access does not exist. And TypeScript is totally fine with that, which is unfortunate because clearly that control doesn't exist. So going to be very error prone. Also, it gets even worse for form arrays. If I have a form group that has a child control, which is a form array, I get type errors. You can see the red squigglies under controls and length and at. Unfortunately, because everything apparently is just an abstract control, TypeScript doesn't know that favorite colors is a form array and therefore doesn't have properties like controls or length, and it doesn't apparently have methods like at, push, or insert. So a bit unfortunate. On top of that, let's go back to how complicated that form array template was, right? In an ideal world, all I'd do is have a form, which I put there for accessibility reasons. And then I would have, yeah, thank you, Wade. Then I'd have an input, and all I do is iterate over the controls and then pass those controls to the form control directive, right? Easy peasy. But no, unfortunately, that doesn't work because the form control directive expects a form control. And Angular thinks that control, or color in this case, is just an abstract control. So I can't do this. I have to do basically the top example, which is very convoluted and confusing. So that's unfortunate. Then the last reason, probably the biggest reason, and the only thing actually listed in that initial issue put on GitHub, is that any is evil. So to go over why it's such a bad thing, let's go ahead and see. I have a control which is dealing with strings. I can set the value to a string, but unfortunately, I can also set it to a Boolean. I can set it to null. I can set it to a number. I can set it to whatever I want. And also, when I'm accessing value, there's no type safety. So I can access properties apparently that are moo.cal.why does this work. Apparently that's fine. Apparently that's a thing. There's no type safety. That's terrible. So introducing the strict types for the Reactive Forms API, and also one very useful feature that they added. Before we get into the details, there are two things I like to start us off with. Is I want to talk briefly about generics and TypeScript. If you're not familiar with generics, I suggest going to TypeScript's official docs. TypeScript does a great job showing you several examples of it. The example you're going to want to look at is the generic classes. The brief idea here is that I can use a generic for my class, which case when I initialize an instance, I can set what that type is for that instance. So for instance, I can create an instance and tell it that you're going to deal with numbers. So when I access the value or set value, I know that I'm dealing with numbers. And if I want to create an instance dealing with strings, I can do the same. I can tell it that it's dealing with strings, so it can set strings, or its value will be strings. And the second thing I want to go over briefly is that this update is completely backwards compatible. So maybe all this strict type stuff is scary. Don't be alarmed. This is if you upgrade to Angular 14, you can easily back out of any of the benefits. I don't know why you would want to do that, but you can. If you don't want to opt into the strict types, simply pass any as the generic type for your form control or your form group or form array, and you will receive the exact same types as before the update. So yeah, so you can see here, I have any, but if you want to opt into the types, simply pass a value, don't pass any, and you can see here when I hover over value, I now properly get the types that I want. I know that it is a string. Also, you can specify it in the generic signature, but it can infer it as well. All right, cool. So now let's talk about the small feature that they added, which during the RFC, they called it initial value is default, which I think is a great descriptive of what that option does, but then they trashed it and they renamed it to non-nullable, which is fine. It is what it is. What does non-nullable do? Well, it achieves a feature that people have been wanting for a very long time. As I mentioned before, when you call reset, it sets the value to null, which is fine, I guess. But with this new option, when you set it to true, non-nullable, when you call reset, what it'll do is it'll set it back to whatever the initial value is. So for favorite color, I initialized it with blue, and when I call reset, that value is also blue. So yay, cool feature. But a little extra thing to this is because using non-nullable, it resets it back to a string, I can now eliminate null as a type. So now my types are even more simple. So that's an extra bonus like that. And I can't go to the next slide again. There you go. All right, cool. So now let's talk about generics for the form group and form array. I showed earlier how to use the generics for the form control, but for form groups, you simply pass an object with your control types and make sure to add string or null. Don't forget the null part unless you want to use that non-nullable flag. And when you do so, you hover over the value. Your form group not only will know that each of the controls are of type string or null, but it also knows what the names of your controls are. So that's pretty cool. Likewise, for arrays, you can pass a form control of a specific type, and it will now know what that type's supposed to be. So in this case, I can pass a form control with the generic signature of a string. Pretty cool. Oh, and then add null. And there you go. No more red squigglies. Awesome. So why is this all important? Well, this is important because having strict types allows us to deliver faster, right? That's one of the benefits of TypeScript. I'm going to have less trips going to documentation. I can stay in VS Code. I can rely on IntelliSense. I can just use the JS docs as needed, and I can just pump out features. One of the biggest problems I see with people trying to use the Reactive Forms API is unless you are very familiar with it and you've struggled with it since version 2, there's a lot of weird gotchas all over the place, right? And you need to know all the little weird things that are involved. But with strict types, you'll get a type error. So you don't have to wonder if you did it right. TypeScript will let you know if you did it right. Because now with strict types, when I want to set my value and I initialize it as a string, I can set it using a string. But if I want to make a mistake and set it as a number, TypeScript will now yell at me and tell me, yeah, no, that's not a thing. You're not supposed to do that. Cool, awesome. Likewise, if I try to access controls that clearly don't exist, that doesn't work anymore, right? You now have type safety. Your form groups know what their control names are, and that's not a thing anymore. Strong types are for weak minds. Yes. Oh, yeah. So the CTO Batovi once said, I forget what he said. He said, what's it? Oh, he bashed TypeScript somehow. I forget what he said, but my response was, oh yeah, so TypeScript is you're stupid if you use TypeScript, right? But my response to that, it's like, no, use TypeScript if you are stupid, right? You can't make any mistakes with TypeScript. So I highly suggest you use TypeScript. But yeah, so yeah, that's great. You can't access controls that don't exist. How lovely is that? And if I have a form array and it's a child of my form group, it will now tell me properly what methods and properties that child control has. How lovely is that? And because of these strict types, my template is now much more simple when I want to use a form array. Isn't that great? I have that form that's just there for reasons, and I can just use a simple ng4, iterate over the controls, pass it as a form control. Lovely. Okay, cool. So that was all great. Let's talk about the couple of gotchas that there are. The first gotcha is that the form array generic doesn't support tuples. And if you don't know what a tuple is, go to the TypeScript docs. A tuple is basically a fancy string, as a fancy array, but you can specify what the type is per index. So for instance, if I wanted an array where the first element is specifically a string and the second element is a number, I can specify that with a tuple. Whereas an array, typically all the elements are assumed to be of the same type. So that's a very specific thing that you can have there. Unfortunately, you can't get away with this with the strict types. I'm sure if enough people complain, they will add it as a feature. But I feel like that is such a narrow use case. I don't see it really happening anytime soon. You can kind of get around it by unioning all the possible types, and this is a decent-ish workaround. But unfortunately, here you can see if I go this route, I can technically set both my controls as strings, and then I didn't want that. I want the first one to be of numbers, the second one to be of, or the first one to be of strings, and the second one to be of numbers. So this kind of works, but not really. And the second gotcha is if you are a fan of the form builder can't infer generic types, or at least during the RFC, it couldn't. It at release can, mostly. There is a very specific case where it doesn't work. For the most part, it works great. If you're not familiar with the form builder in Angular, the form builder is essentially just a way to quickly pump out reactive forms. It allows for syntactic sugar, so it leads to less syntax and less imports. So here at the top of my colors form, I am creating my form group using the constructors, form group and form control. In the second attempt, I'm using the group helper, which is useful. And if all my controls happen to be non-nullable, I can do that too. With the form builder, I simply use the non-nullable property. But if I want to mix and match, if I want my favorite color to be non-nullable, but my least favorite color to not be non-nullable, unfortunately, that is where you are out of luck. There is no way to do that with the form group or the group helper. You'll have to resort back to using the constructors, unfortunately. But that's also a very niche use case. You probably won't even realize it's a problem. And that is all the gotchas. So if you are excited about reactive forms or about upgrading to Angular, I highly suggest you check out the RFC. It is heavily documented with all the reasons for why they did what, examples for days, and lots of discussion. They've definitely have hopped back and forth between ideas. So it's a very interesting read at the very least. And if you aren't on Angular 14, I highly suggest that you hop on to Angular 14, especially if you use reactive forms, not just because of all the benefits that you'll get from all these major releases, but at the very least, if you're on, like, for instance, 13, the upgrade steps are simply copy and paste this line, paste it into your terminal, and then commit. It's not too bad. Fairly straightforward process. So yeah, I've rambled on a bit. Here's a bunch of documentation or links to various things. Here's some docs. Here's another blog post or a couple, and a demo that I wrote if you want to play with the strict types and compare and contrast between the two. So yeah. Questions?
Yeah, thank you. What questions do we have? That was awesome, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sure, somebody's got to have a question, although he did cover everything pretty thoroughly.
I assume everyone is just in awe. I know I was when Angular 14 came out.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're still on 13, so maybe I'll have to update to 14.
Like I said, it is
15 just came out today, right?
Or 15. 15 came out. Yeah, so 15 came out today. Yeah, there's going to be the what's it called? The live
The upgrade party or kickoff
upgrade
or whatever they
party.
call it.
Yeah, that's on Friday, I believe. So if you if you haven't put a reminder for it on YouTube, go Google the Angular channel and be sure to put that reminder on.
I'll have to check that out.
Yeah.
So no questions because Mark was so awesome. Are any use for form builders over template forms?
So when you say form builders, I assume reactive forms over template forms.
That's what I'm thinking.
Yes. So yeah, ish. There was a present, I forget who the presenter was, but I think it was NGConf 2021 where they rebutted over all of the praise that reactive forms has to give and showed exactly how to do it through template forms or template driven forms. So basically anything that you can do with reactive forms, at the end of the day, you can do it with template driven forms. So in that sense, it's more or less whatever your preference is. The question you might want to ask yourself is, where do you want to spend most of your time? Do you want to spend your time in the template, or do you want to spend your time in the component class? So that is the determining factor in my head.
Thank you. I think I remember that presentation.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
Yeah, I also liked Jennifer's follow-up presentation, where basically it's just a compare and contrast of both.
Yes,
both are fine.
right. I remember those. Yeah, those were both very good.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions for Mark?
Yeah.
And I assume you'll give us your slides too?
I will, if I can figure out how to do it. So I have, I can send you the
You should be able to export it as a PDF. That's what I ended up doing.
Okay, so I can export
and
it
then
as
just
a
share
PDF.
that.
Okay.
Your drive.
I'll add it. Okay, I'll add it to a drive and then I can post the link.
Okay.
I don't know if PDF support GIFs though.
I'll send the
Probably they
slides. How
do.
about that? I'll send the PPTX.
Okay, that works.
Yeah.
Okay, any more questions? If not, I'll go ahead and stop the recording unless anybody has any questions. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording after I figure out where this stop recording is.